Hi, I'm Ethan. I came home from a war zone in Iraq only to find the real battle was in my own house with my own parents. They left my grandmother to die alone, so they could sip champagne on a yacht in St. Bart's. I learned that day that some monsters don't hide in the dark. They post smiling pictures on Instagram. Have you ever felt completely betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you? Before I tell you what I found in her room that night, the thing that changed everything, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when a soldier decides to fight for his own family's honor. The exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on me after 18 months of sand, sun, and the constant hum of anxiety. The flight from Baghdad to JFK was a blur, and the long drive out to the family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, felt even longer. I sat in the back of the town car, watching the manicured suburbs of the wealthy roll by, feeling a million miles away from it all. I wasn't expecting a parade or a hero's welcome. I just wanted the quiet comfort of home, the familiar faces of my family. As the heavy iron gate swung open and we crunched up the long gravel driveway, I saw the house perfect as always. But the silence that greeted me was wrong. It was a deep, hollow quiet that felt more like an absence than peace. I let myself in with my old key. The cold marble of the grand foyer echoed with every step I took, my combat boots feeling out of place on the polished stone. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the high ceilings. Nothing, just the slow, steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had been the backdrop to my entire childhood. Now it sounded ominous, like a timer counting down to something terrible. I saw a pile of mail on the antique silver tray by the door. Unopened bills, glossy magazines, invitations. My parents, Richard and Cynthia, were obsessed with appearances. They would never let mail pile up. A knot of pure dread tightened in my stomach. I dropped my duffel bag, and the heavy thud echoed through the empty mansion. My first and only thought was of my grandmother, Eleanor. She lived in the East Wing, a place that had always been her sanctuary. I took the sweeping main staircase 2 steps at a time, my boots sinking into the plush carpet runner. Her part of the house was always quieter than the rest, but this was a different kind of silence. It was heavy, breathless, like the air itself was holding its breath. The ornate wooden door to her bedroom was slightly ajar. I pushed it open gently, my heart pounding against my ribs. The room was dark, the thick velvet curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. I could just make out her small, frail shape in the center of the enormous 4-poster bed. "Grandma?" I whispered, my voice cracking. There was no answer, only the sound of a faint, shallow breath. Just as a cold, paralyzing fear washed over me, I heard a car pull up outside. A few minutes later, a woman I vaguely recognized as the part-time caregiver, Maria, came rushing up the stairs, her face etched with worry. She stopped dead when she saw me, her eyes wide with surprise. She explained in a hushed, nervous voice that my grandmother's health had taken a sharp decline weeks ago. She'd been calling my parents, leaving messages, telling them the doctor said it was only a matter of time. She told them Eleanor was asking for them, for her son. Maria looked down at her hands, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and shame as if she were somehow responsible. "They said the trip was non-refundable," she whispered, the words hanging in the still air like a death sentence. Non-refundable. The phrase bounced around in my head, nonsensical and monstrous. My hands were shaking, not from exhaustion anymore, but from a rage so pure and cold it felt like ice water flooding my veins. I pulled out my phone, my thumbs swiping through the screen out of a numb, disconnected habit I'd developed overseas to feel closer to a world I no longer recognized. I opened Instagram, and there they were. My mother's latest post, uploaded just 3 hours earlier. It was a photo of her and my father, Richard, standing on the deck of a gleaming white yacht, the turquoise water of the Caribbean sparkling behind them. They were holding champagne flutes, their faces tanned, their smiles wide and painfully bright. The caption read, "Living our best life in St. Bart's. Paradise, Mom, blessed." I looked from the glowing screen of my phone to the dim, suffocating room where the woman who raised me was fading away. The contrast was a physical assault. The brilliant sunshine of their paradise against the darkness of her bedroom, the sound of their laughter, which I could almost hear against the strange, shallow rhythm of her breathing, their designer resort wear against the simple cotton nightgown that hung loosely on her frail frame. In that instant, my fatigue evaporated. It was replaced by a calm, chilling fury I hadn't even felt in the heat of combat. This wasn't the chaos of war. This was a deliberate, calculated act of cruelty. This was a betrayal so deep and selfish, it fractured the very foundation of who I thought my family was. I sat down on the edge of her bed and took her hand. It was so thin and cold, her skin like delicate parchment. My mind flashed back to my grandfather, a man who built this entire fortune with his own 2 hands, a man of quiet integrity and immense character. He used to sit in this very room with me, long after my parents had left for some gala or charity ball, and tell me that all of this, the house, the money, the name, it wasn't a prize, it was a responsibility. Character is the only currency that matters in the end, Ethan, he'd said, his gaze firm and knowing. Don't ever let them convince you otherwise. I understood now that he wasn't just giving me life advice. He was giving me a warning about his own son. Staring at my grandmother's peaceful, unknowing face, I made a silent vow. There would be no screaming match when they returned from their island getaway, tanned and full of stories. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a dramatic confrontation they could twist into a story about their troubled, angry son. My military training had taught me one thing above all else. Emotion is a liability in a conflict. Strategy, patience, and decisive, overwhelming action are what win a war. I would be calm. I would be methodical. And I would get justice for her, and for the grandfather whose legacy they had so thoroughly tarnished. In that dark, quiet room, my mission became crystal clear. I wasn't just home from one war. I was about to begin a new one. I spent the next few hours in a state of controlled calm, the kind of focus that only comes when the mission is absolute. The fury I felt was a clean, cold fuel. My first call wasn't to my parents, but to Dr. Miller, our old family physician and a friend of my grandfather's. I didn't use the house landline. I used my cell, paying for the call myself. It felt important, like drawing a line in the sand. I explained the situation in short, precise sentences, stripped of emotion. He was there within the hour. His face, usually so warm and grandfatherly, was a grim mask of professional concern that couldn't quite hide his deep, personal disappointment. He examined my grandmother with a gentle reverence that was a stark contrast to the casual cruelty of her own son. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken condemnation. After his examination, Dr. Miller pulled me aside into the hallway. The look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke a word. "She's severely dehydrated and malnourished, Ethan," he said, his voice a low, pained whisper. "This didn't happen overnight. This is the result of weeks, maybe months of inadequate care." He looked back toward the bedroom door, then at me, his gaze filled with a sorrow that went beyond a doctor's diagnosis. "I tried to tell your father how serious this was. He said I was overreacting, that his mother had always been a strong woman. He told me they had travel plans they simply couldn't change." The words hung in the air, a testament to a son's profound and unforgivable failure. My fists clenched at my sides, the knuckles white. It wasn't just neglect. It was a conscious decision. That first night was the longest of my life. I sat in the wing-back chair next to her bed, the same one my grandfather used to sit in, and just watched her breathe. The only sounds were the shallow whisper of her breath and the relentless tick-tock of the antique clock in the hall, each second a hammer blow marking time that had been stolen from her. The sprawling empty mansion felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. All the art on the walls, the Persian rugs, the crystal chandeliers, it all seemed obscene, a monument to greed and vanity. I thought about the men I'd served with, guys who would give anything to see their mothers again, who treasured faded photographs and tear-stained letters. And here in this palace, a mother was discarded like last season's fashion. The injustice of it was a physical ache in my chest. As the sun began to rise, casting long grey shadows across the room, I started to notice the small, damning details of her abandonment. Her favorite book, a worn copy of Leaves of Grass, lay on the floor just beyond her reach, as if it had fallen and she hadn't had the strength to pick it up. The glass of water on her nightstand was empty, with a faint film of dust on the rim. The family photos on her dresser had been turned to face the wall, all except for one, a black and white portrait of her and my grandfather on their wedding day. It was a quiet, heartbreaking protest. She had erased the children who had erased her. Each detail was a fresh stab of pain, a testament not to a single act of cruelty, but to 1,000 tiny moments of indifference that, when woven together, created a shroud of profound loneliness. Around dawn, she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, thin and papery. For a moment, her eyes, cloudy with age and medication, seemed to focus on me. A single raspy word escaped her lips. "Richard?" she whispered, thinking I was my father. The hope and confusion in that one word shattered the cold armor I had built around myself. She was still looking for him, still hoping her son would come. I took her hand, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "No, Grandma. It's Ethan. I'm here now." A flicker of recognition, or maybe just relief, crossed her face before her eyes drifted closed again. In that moment, my mission solidified. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about redemption. It was about making sure that the last thing she knew wasn't the pain of being forgotten, but the peace of being loved. My phone, which I'd set to silent, lit up on the nightstand. A text from my mother. "Darling, we heard you landed, so proud. Can't wait to hear all about it. The reception out here is spotty, but we'll call as soon as we can. XOXO. The cheerful, oblivious tone, the casual use of darling, felt like a slap in the face. It was followed by a picture of her feet propped up on a railing, the ocean stretching out behind them, a half-empty glass of something pink and bubbly in her hand. I stared at the image until the screen went dark. They were living in a different reality, a world built on self-indulgence and willful ignorance. A world where their comfort was paramount, and their mother's life was a minor inconvenience. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a vast empty distance. They weren't my parents. They were just two strangers who happened to share my DNA. I remembered standing with my grandfather in his study, a room lined with books on history and philosophy, not finance. I must have been 16. My father had just traded in a perfectly good Mercedes for the newest model, a flashy, ostentatious car that screamed, "New money." My grandfather had watched him drive away, a look of deep weariness on his face. He turned to me and put a hand on my shoulder. "Your father," he said slowly, "has spent his entire life confusing price with value. He knows the cost of everything and the worth of nothing." He tapped a framed photo of my grandmother on his desk. "This is wealth, Ethan. Character, loyalty, love. The rest is just noise." I finally understood the profound warning he was giving me. He saw the rot starting to set in even then. The next day, Maria came, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She brought a small bouquet of daisies from her own garden and placed them in a vase by my grandmother's bed. Hesitantly, as if confessing a crime, she showed me her phone. She scrolled through a series of text messages with my mother, Cynthia. Maria had been pleading for weeks, sending updates on Eleanor's deteriorating condition, begging to increase her hours or to hire a registered nurse. My mother's replies were curt and dismissive. "She's just looking for attention, Maria. Don't be so dramatic. The agency fees are astronomical. We have to be practical." The final text, sent the day before they left for St. Bart's, was the most chilling. "We have this trip booked. It's non-negotiable. Just make sure she takes her pills. We'll deal with it when we get back." It was all there in black and white, cold, calculated, and utterly heartless. Seeing those texts was like finding the final piece of a very ugly puzzle. This wasn't just a case of selfish people being thoughtless. This was a strategy. Cutting the caregiver's hours, ignoring the doctor's warnings, dismissing my grandmother's suffering as dramatic. It was all designed to minimize their expenses and their inconvenience. They were protecting their inheritance, treating their mother not as a person, but as a line item on a budget that was interfering with their lifestyle. The champagne they were drinking on that yacht was bought with the money they saved by denying her proper care. The injustice was so profound, so fundamentally evil, that it settled deep in my bones, hardening into a resolve as strong as steel. They had chosen their path. Now I would choose mine. That evening, after Maria left and the house fell silent again, my grandfather's words about price versus value echoed in my mind. And with them came another memory, his study. He had an old, formidable-looking safe hidden behind a false panel of leather-bound books. My father had spent years trying to get him to reveal the combination, half joking about the family jewels hidden inside. My grandfather would just smile. Everything in there is for someone who understands its value, Richard, not its price. I knew with a certainty that felt like a command from beyond the grave that I had to get into that safe. Whatever was inside, it was part of his true legacy, the one he had tried to protect from his own son. The mission now had a tangible objective. Sitting there in the dim light, holding my grandmother's hand, I felt the weight of my uniform settle on me in a new way. In Iraq, my duty was to my country, to my unit. It was clear and defined. Here in the suffocating quiet of my own home, the lines were blurred, but the duty was even more profound. I was no longer just a son or a grandson. I was the custodian of my grandfather's honor and the guardian of my grandmother's dignity. My parents had abdicated their roles, trading them for a temporary paradise. They didn't realize they had left the entire kingdom unguarded, and now the soldier was home and he was taking command. The exhaustion was gone, burned away by the cold fire of purpose. The real battle was about to begin. I knew I couldn't just sit there. The image of that safe, hidden away in my grandfather's study, became an obsession. It felt like he had left a message for me, a final order, and I was duty-bound to see it through. Leaving my grandmother's side, even for a moment, felt like a betrayal, but staying and doing nothing felt like a bigger one. I whispered to her that I'd be right back, my voice barely audible in the stillness, and slipped out of the room. I walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the west wing, my boots silent on the plush wool. The study door was closed, and as I turned the heavy brass knob, I felt like I was crossing a threshold into the past, into the one part of this house that still felt like a home, a place of substance and integrity. The room was just as I remembered it, yet fundamentally altered. The familiar scent of old leather, paper, and his signature pipe tobacco was still there, but it was tainted by something else, my father's cloying, expensive cologne. The grand mahogany desk, which had once held maps, historical biographies, and my grandfather's worn fountain pen, was now cluttered with stacks of glossy financial reports, a sleek silver laptop, and a crystal glass with the dregs of what was probably a very expensive scotch. My father had colonized this sanctuary, turning a place of quiet contemplation into an outpost of his shallow empire. A fresh wave of anger, cold and precise, washed over me. This wasn't just an office. It was a desecration. He had taken the one space that represented my grandfather's character and had tried to remake it in his own image, an image of pure, unadulterated greed. My eyes scanned the built-in bookshelves that lined the walls, a floor-to-ceiling testament to a life of curiosity and learning. I remembered my grandfather showing me the trick panel when I was a boy, a secret shared between us. Some things are meant to be protected from those who don't understand their value, he'd said, his eyes twinkling. I ran my fingers over the spines of the books he'd pointed to, Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Ethics, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Philosophers, not financiers. I found the hidden latch, and with a soft click a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing the dark, cold steel of the safe. It was older than I was, a massive, imposing thing with a single brass dial. A jolt of adrenaline shot through me. I was here. I had found it, but my triumph was immediately tempered by a heavy dose of reality. I had no idea what the combination was. I slumped into my grandfather's worn leather armchair, the one that still bore the faint impression of his frame. I stared at the dial, a circle of numbers that held the key to everything. My father had hired locksmiths, even a so-called safe cracker, after my grandfather passed, but the old man had built this house to last, and the safe was part of its foundation. They had all failed. What made me think I could succeed? I leaned my head back, the cool leather a small comfort, and tried to quiet my mind. I had to think like him. He was a man of logic and principle, not sentiment. He wouldn't have used a birthday or an anniversary. Those were common knowledge, easily guessed. The combination had to be something personal, something that meant something only to him, something that symbolized his core values. But what? Then a memory surfaced, hazy at first, then sharpening into focus. I was about 14, helping him organize some old photographs. We came across a faded black-and-white picture of him, as a young man in a Navy uniform standing on the deck of a warship. He rarely spoke of his time in Korea, but that day he did. He pointed to the ship. "That was the USS Johnston," he said, his voice quiet. "DD 821. That number, it was more than just a number. It was our identity. It meant we had a duty to each other, a responsibility to bring each other home." Duty. Responsibility. The words echoed in my mind. It was a long shot, a wild guess based on a half-forgotten conversation, but it felt right. It wasn't a number tied to money or family celebrations. It was a number tied to honor. My hands were shaking as I knelt in front of the safe. The cold brass of the dial felt like a live thing beneath my fingertips. I took a deep breath, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light from the window, and began to turn it. Right to 8, left past 8 to 2, right to 1. The clicks of the tumblers were like gunshots in the profound silence of the house. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of hope and fear. I finished the sequence and took hold of the heavy, ornate handle. I pulled, it didn't budge. I tried again, yanking with all my strength, but it was locked solid. A crushing weight of failure settled on me. I was wrong. It was all for nothing. I leaned my forehead against the cold steel door, the frustration so intense it felt like I couldn't breathe. I was wasting time while my grandmother was fading away in the other room. Just as I was about to give up, to retreat in defeat, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The screen lit up with a text message. It was from my father. My blood ran cold. It read, "Cynthia tells me you made it home. Good, stay out of my study. I have important documents on the desk. We'll be back Friday to sort everything out. Your grandmother is a tough old bird. She'll be fine." The arrogance, the condescension, the complete and utter detachment from reality, it was staggering. He called this sacred space my study. He called his dying mother a tough old bird. That text wasn't a message. It was a bucket of ice water to the face. The despair vanished, replaced by a diamond-hard clarity. He had inadvertently given me the final push I needed. I wasn't just trying to get into a safe anymore. I was taking back my family's honor from a man who had no concept of the word. I looked at the safe again, my mind racing. The ship's number was part of it, I was sure of it. But what was I missing? My grandfather was a man of layers, of quiet complexities. Duty was one part of his life, but there was another, equally important part. My grandmother, Eleanor. His love for her was the bedrock of his existence. And then another memory hit me, another piece of that long-ago conversation. He had told me the date he was honorably discharged from the Navy. The day my service to my country ended, and my service to my family began, he'd called it. It was the day he came home for good, the day he asked Eleanor to marry him. It was a date that represented the joining of his two greatest commitments, duty and love. Of course, it wasn't one number. It was a sequence. With a renewed sense of purpose, my fingers flew across the dial. The whole number first, 8221, then the date of his discharge, month, day, year. The click sounded different this time, more resonant, more certain. As I made the final turn, I heard it. A deep, solid thunk from within the mechanism. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I held my breath and pulled the handle. It turned smoothly, and the massive steel door swung open with a low hydraulic hiss, releasing a puff of air that smelled of history, of cedar and sealed memories. My eyes adjusted to the darkness within. There were no stacks of cash, no gold bars, no glittering jewels. It was filled with what looked like old letters, property deeds, and several large sealed manila envelopes, each neatly labeled in my grandfather's distinctive, elegant handwriting. One envelope was thicker than the rest, sitting right on top of the pile. My name, Ethan, was written across the front in bold black ink. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. It was heavy, substantial. I carefully broke the wax seal and pulled out the contents. The first document was thick, legal-sized paper, bound with a blue ribbon. I recognized the letterhead of my grandfather's old law firm. It was his last will and testament. But tucked inside was a smaller personal envelope, also addressed to me. I unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was a letter written in his familiar hand. The first sentence leaped off the page and seared itself into my brain. My dearest Ethan, if you are reading this, it means I was right to worry, and your father has finally allowed his greed to eclipse his humanity. A noise from the hallway, Maria coming to check on me, made me jump. I quickly folded the letter, shoved the entire envelope inside my shirt, and swung the heavy safe door closed just as she knocked. The mission had changed. I had the truth right here against my skin. Now I just had to make it back to my grandmother's side before it was too late. I slipped back into my grandmother's room, the heavy envelope tucked inside my shirt, a secret weight against my chest. The paper felt both hot and cold against my skin, a physical manifestation of the truth I now carried. I sat back down in the wingback chair, my body rigid with a new kind of tension. My grandmother was still breathing, her chest rising and falling in that same shallow, fragile rhythm, completely unaware of the bombshell her husband had left behind. In the dim light, I looked from her peaceful, unknowing face to the outline of the will beneath my clothes. It felt like I was holding the past and the future in the same moment. A sacred trust passed from one generation to the next, skipping the one that had proven itself unworthy. The silence in the room was no longer just sad. It was charged. The quiet before a storm I knew I was about to unleash. I took her hand again, my grip a little tighter, a silent promise to see this through to the end. A few hours later, just as the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the heavy curtains, she was gone. So it wasn't a dramatic or painful passing. One moment I was watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, and the next, there was only stillness. She had simply slipped away in her sleep, her face finally free from the lines of pain and confusion. A profound hollow silence descended upon the room, a quiet so complete it felt like the world had stopped turning. I sat there for a long time holding her hand, which was slowly growing cold in mine. There were no tears, not yet, just a vast empty space where my anger had been, now filled with a deep aching sorrow. Her fight was over. Mine was just beginning. Her peaceful end was the final piece of evidence against them, the ultimate proof of their abandonment. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a verdict. And I was now the executioner of the sentence my grandfather had written years ago. The phone calls began like a slow, predictable tide. First I called Dr. Miller, who spoke with a quiet, professional sadness that couldn't mask his personal grief. Then I called Maria, whose heartbroken sobs on the other end of the line were the only truly honest expression of loss I would hear that day. Finally, my phone rang, displaying my father's name. I let it ring 3 times before answering, taking a deep breath to steady my voice. "She's gone," I said, my tone flat, offering no details, no comfort. There was a pause, a beat of what I assume was feigned shock. "Oh, God," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too theatrical. "My mother." I can't believe it, but his grief quickly pivoted to logistics. "We'll be on the first flight back. We need to call the funeral home, the one in Greenwich, the best one. We need to make sure this is handled with dignity." It was all about appearances, about managing the narrative. He wasn't mourning his mother. He was managing a public relations crisis. They arrived the next evening, stepping out of a black Lincoln Navigator, looking tanned and tired, their expensive linen travel clothes seeming absurdly out of place in the somber atmosphere of the house. My mother, Cynthia, rushed toward me, her arms outstretched for a hug, her face a carefully constructed mask of sorrow. I stood my ground, and her embrace became an awkward, one-sided pat on my back. She smelled of expensive perfume and airplane air. "Oh, Ethan, darling," she whispered, her voice cracking with practiced emotion. "I'm so sorry you had to be here alone for this." My father stood behind her, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the grand foyer as if assessing property values. He wore a Patek Philippe watch, its polished face catching the light from the chandelier. It was a subtle, sickening reminder that for them, time was money, and their mother's time had simply run out, an inconvenient expense finally off the books. The days that followed were a surreal performance of grief. My parents moved through the house with a somber purpose, orchestrating the funeral with the same ruthless efficiency they applied to their business dealings. They chose the most expensive casket, a polished mahogany monstrosity that would have horrified my grandmother. They ordered mountains of white lilies and roses, filling the house with a cloying, funereal scent that felt suffocating. The guest list for the service was meticulously curated, a who's who of Greenwich society, and my father's most important business associates. I watched them on the phone, their voices hushed and mournful, accepting condolences while simultaneously networking. It wasn't about honoring Eleanor. It was about leveraging her death to reinforce their social standing. I was a ghost in my own home, a silent observer to their grotesque theatre, the will hidden in my room like a single live grenade. The funeral was a perfectly staged production. The church was filled with people in designer black, their faces etched with polite, distant sympathy. My father delivered a eulogy that was a masterpiece of fiction, painting a picture of a cherished matriarch and a devoted son, conveniently omitting the part where he left her to die alone while he toasted his success in the Caribbean. I stood at the graveside, the cold Connecticut wind whipping at my suit, and listened as people murmured about how devastated Richard and Cynthia must be. The hypocrisy was a physical thing, a bitter taste in the back of my throat. I didn't look at my parents. I kept my eyes fixed on the casket as it was lowered into the earth, the only real and honest thing in the entire charade. I felt a profound, isolating rage, but my training held it in check, hardening it into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. This performance was for them. The reality would be for me. After the service back at the mansion, during the sterile and catered reception, a man I barely recognized approached me. He was a distant cousin, a quiet man my grandfather had always spoken of with deep respect. He bypassed my parents, who were holding court near the fireplace, and came straight to me. He put a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm, his eyes clear and knowing. "Your grandfather was worried about this day," he said, his voice low. "He told me once that he put his faith not in his son, but in his son's son. He said you had his spine." He squeezed my shoulder once more. "You being here with her at the end. You did the right thing, son. He would be immensely proud." His words were like a shield, a validation from the past that strengthened my resolve. I wasn't alone in this. I was an agent of my grandfather's will, and now I had a witness to his intent. The call came 2 days later. It was Mr. Davies, the family's longtime attorney, his voice professionally somber, as he scheduled the reading of the will for the following Friday. My father took the call on speakerphone in the study, and I listened from the doorway unseen. His tone was immediately lighter, shifting from grieving son to expectant heir. "Of course, Harold, Friday is perfect," he said. "We need to start getting things in order. The estate is quite complex, as you know." He was already talking about appraisals, about liquidating certain assets, about selling off my grandmother's wing of the house to build a state-of-the-art gym and wine cellar. He spoke as if it were all a foregone conclusion, a simple transaction. I stood there listening to him carve up a future that wasn't his, and the weight of the envelope in my room felt heavier than ever. The countdown had begun. That night sleep was impossible. The cavernous house was silent, except for the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock, each tick a second closer to the moment of reckoning. I found myself back in the study, the scent of my grandfather's pipe tobacco now almost completely gone, replaced by the sterile smell of my father's ambition. I opened the safe, the combination now as familiar as my own service number, and pulled out the letter. I read it again under the dim light of the desk lamp. "So your father sees this house as a trophy," he had written. "I see it as a legacy. A legacy is not about what you leave for people, Ethan. It's about what you leave in them. Do what is right, not what is easy. Protect her memory. Protect our name from those who would tarnish it for profit." The words weren't just advice. They were my final orders. I folded the letter, placed it back with the will, and felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. I knew my mission. The morning of the meeting, I chose my clothes with care. Not my uniform, which they saw as a prop, but a simple charcoal suit my grandfather had insisted on buying me for my college graduation. It felt like his armor. I met my parents in the foyer. They were immaculate in their somber, expensive black attire, the very picture of grieving wealthy heirs. My father, seeing me, managed a tight smile and clapped me on the shoulder in a gesture of false masculine solidarity. "Ready to get this over with, son?" "Just a formality, really." He looked past me, his eyes already on the future he believed he was about to inherit. I met his gaze, my own expression unreadable, my voice steady and calm. "I'm ready," I said. The words hung in the air between us, pregnant with a meaning he was utterly incapable of understanding. The silent drive to the lawyer's office in his gleaming black BMW felt like the final, quiet approach to a battlefield. The lawyer's office was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood visits with my grandfather. Walls of dark mahogany, The faint, comforting smell of old books and leather, and a silence that felt heavy with the weight of important decisions. Mr. Davies, a man who seemed to be the same age for the last 30 years, greeted us with a somber, professional nod. He was the embodiment of old-world discretion, his face a neutral mask that gave nothing away. My parents, however, were less composed. They moved with a restless energy, an air of entitled impatience. My father, Richard, even checked his Rolex and made a quiet comment to my mother about hoping this didn't take all afternoon. They saw this meeting not as the final chapter of a life, but as the first step in a major financial transaction. They were here to collect. We sat around the massive, polished conference table, the three of us on one side, Mr. Davies on the other. He laid a thick, cream-colored document bound in a blue ribbon on the table between us. It was the will my parents had filed. "As you know," he began, his voice a dry rustle of paper, "we are here to execute the last will and testament of your father and father-in-law." He started reading the preamble in a steady, unemotional monotone. My mother, Cynthia, shifted in her chair, subtly adjusting the collar of her black silk blouse and glancing at her reflection in the dark wood of the table. My father leaned back, crossing his legs, assuming a posture of relaxed ownership. He already believed everything in this room, and by extension the entire estate belonged to him. I said nothing. I kept my hand on the worn leather briefcase in my lap, its contents a silent, ticking bomb. Mr. Davies continued, his voice droning on through the legal jargon until he reached the core of the document, the bequests. As expected, it was a clean sweep for my father. The sprawling Greenwich estate, the carefully curated stock portfolio worth millions, the art collection my grandfather had spent a lifetime acquiring. It was all left to my beloved son, Richard. I was mentioned, but only as an afterthought. A small trust fund was to be established in my name, but the document stipulated that my father would be the sole trustee, with full discretion to release funds only when he deemed I had matured into a man of sound financial judgment. It was the ultimate insult, a final posthumous vote of no confidence, orchestrated by my father. He nodded slowly as this was read, a grave, paternalistic expression on his face, as if he were accepting a great and solemn burden. My mother shot me a quick, pitying glance that was pure victory. Just as Mr. Davies turned to the final page for signatures to begin the probate process, I cleared my throat. It wasn't a loud sound, but in the tomb-like silence of the office it cracked like a whip. My parents both turned to look at me, their faces a mask of irritation. Why was I interrupting their coronation? Mr. Davies paused, his pen hovering over the paper, and peered at me over the top of his reading glasses. "Is there an issue, Ethan?" he asked, his tone perfectly level, though I saw a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, in his sharp, intelligent eyes. My father waved a dismissive hand. "Ethan, for God's sake, don't make a scene. This is difficult enough as it is." He wasn't talking about grief. He was talking about the tedious necessity of listening to legal language before he could call his broker. I ignored him completely. My focus was entirely on the old lawyer, the one man in the room who represented the law, not greed. "Mr. Davies," I said, my voice coming out stronger and clearer than I expected, "I have reason to believe you are working from a superseded document." My father scoffed loudly, but I kept my eyes on the lawyer. With deliberate, measured movements, I placed my briefcase on the table, clicked open the brass latches and drew out the heavy manila envelope. The wax seal my grandfather had pressed into place was still mostly intact. I slid it across the polished surface until it stopped directly in front of him. "This," I stated, tapping the envelope with my index finger, "is my grandfather's true and final will, executed 6 months after the date on the document you currently hold. It was entrusted to me." The air in the room became thin, charged, and utterly silent. My father stared at the envelope, his mouth slightly agape, as if he couldn't process what he was seeing. Then a short barking laugh escaped his lips. "This is ridiculous. What is this, some kind of pathetic power play, Ethan? Did you forge this in your barracks?" My mother chimed in, her voice dripping with condescending concern. "Darling, what are you doing? This is hardly the time or the place for these theatrics." But Mr. Davies wasn't listening to them. His entire attention was on the envelope. He picked it up with a reverence that silenced my parents. He examined the notary's seal, the date and the familiar elegant scrawl of my grandfather's signature. He held it up to the light. He was no longer just a lawyer. He was an arbiter, and my parents suddenly seemed to understand that they were no longer in control of this room. Without a word, Mr. Davies took a small silver letter opener from his desk set and carefully sliced open the envelope. He slid out the documents within, his movements precise and unhurried. He spent what felt like an eternity reading, the only sound in the universe the soft rustle of the thick legal-grade paper. My father's leg began to bounce, a frantic, nervous rhythm against the floor. My mother's perfectly manicured hands were clenched into tight fists in her lap. The confident, entitled airs were gone, replaced by two anxious, cornered people. Finally, Mr. Davies set the papers down, stacked them into a neat pile, and removed his glasses. He looked directly at my parents, his expression as cold and hard as granite. "This will is legal, binding, and correctly executed," he announced. "It contains a clause that explicitly revokes all prior wills and testaments. This is now the governing document of the estate." He began to read from the new will, and his voice now carried the undeniable weight of finality. The first bequest was a stunner. A sum of $2 million from the liquid assets was to be donated to a specific charitable foundation that supported elder care and hospice workers. There was a handwritten addendum, initialed by my grandfather, specifically mentioning Maria, the caregiver, by name, and thanking her for providing the dignity and compassion that my own blood failed to offer. My mother made a small, strangled sound, a mix between a gasp and a sob of outrage. My father's face had lost all its color. He looked like a man who had just been told his entire world was a fiction. The St. Bart's tan now looked like a cheap painted-on mask. Then came the main event. Mr. Davies paused, looking at each of us in turn before he continued. "Regarding the primary family assets, including the estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, all related properties, and the entirety of the investment portfolio." He let the words hang in the air, a multi-million-dollar guillotine. My father leaned forward, a desperate, last-ditch hope flickering in his eyes. "My grandfather has directed that these assets be placed into a revocable living trust." Mr. Davies looked directly at me. "The sole beneficiary and appointed trustee of this trust, effective upon his 25th birthday, is his grandson, Ethan." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. My father physically recoiled in his chair, his face a mask of utter disbelief. My mother simply stared, her mouth open, the carefully constructed facade of the grieving socialite crumbling into dust, revealing the raw, ugly face of pure greed beneath. The final section of the will was not just a legal directive, it was a judgment. It was my grandfather's final devastating verdict on the character of his only son. For Richard and Cynthia, he left a modest monthly stipend, enough to live a comfortable middle-class life, but not nearly enough to sustain their jet-setting, luxury brand existence. But the true genius of his plan was in the conditions attached. The stipend was contingent upon them vacating the Greenwich property within 90 days, and was to be immediately and permanently terminated if they ever dared to contest the will's legitimacy in court. He hadn't just disinherited them. He had caged them, leaving them just enough to survive but stripping them of the one thing they truly valued, their status. They were being unceremoniously evicted from the life they had taken for granted. The professional calm of the room finally shattered. "This is a disgrace, a complete fabrication," my father yelled, his voice cracking with rage. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me. He was an old, senile man. "You manipulated him. You got into his head, you ungrateful parasite." My mother, finally finding her voice, joined the chorus, her words a venomous hiss. "How could you do this to your own father?" Mr. Davies remained impassive. He calmly put his glasses back on and looked at my father with an expression of mild disappointment. "Richard, I would strongly advise you to sit down. Paragraph 7 includes signed and notarized affidavits from 2 separate geriatric specialists, confirming your father was of exceptionally sound mind and body at the time of this will's creation." My father's rage collapsed like a punctured lung. He sank back into his chair, his face slack, his eyes empty. He was a king who had just watched his entire kingdom dissolve into smoke, In that moment, watching their world burn, I felt nothing. No joy, no satisfaction, no revenge. Just the cold, quiet peace of a mission accomplished. The drive back from the lawyer's office was the quietest I had ever experienced in my father's car. He drove the BMW not with his usual aggressive confidence, but with the slow, hesitant movements of an old man who wasn't sure where he was going. The silence was thick, broken only by the almost imperceptible sound of my mother crying into a silk handkerchief. It wasn't the sound of grief. It was the sound of loss, but the loss of status, of power, of a future she had believed was guaranteed. I sat in the back, the leather briefcase containing the true will resting on my lap. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like a surgeon who had just performed a painful but necessary amputation. The rot had been cut out, but the wound was still fresh, and the phantom limb of our old family structure would ache for a long time. They were strangers to me now, and the vast empty space in the luxury car felt like a universe stretching between us. The 90 days that followed were a masterclass in quiet, resentful dismantling. The house, which had once been a stage for their elaborate parties and social climbing, became a warehouse of their defeat. Movers, gruff and indifferent to our family drama, tramped through the marble foyer in their work boots, carrying out antique furniture, boxes of designer clothes and crates of fine wine. My parents moved like ghosts through the emptying rooms, their conversations reduced to clipped, bitter arguments about what to sell and what to put into storage. They never spoke to me directly, only around me as if I were a piece of furniture they no longer owned. I stayed in my grandmother's wing, listening to the sounds of their life being packed away. The echo of their footsteps on the bare wood floors was the sound of their reign ending, not with a bang, but with the squeal of packing tape and the heavy thud of a closing truck door. One of the first calls I made was not to a financial advisor, but to Maria. I found her number in my grandmother's old address book. When I told her about the $2 million my grandfather had left for the Hospice Foundation and the personal bequest for her, she was silent for a long time. Then she just started weeping, a sound of such profound, unadulterated shock and gratitude that it brought a lump to my own throat. She kept saying, "But why?" I was just doing my job, and I told her, my voice steady, "Because my grandfather believed in rewarding character, Maria. He saw what you did. He knew." In that one phone call, I felt the true weight of my inheritance. It wasn't about the money. It was about the power to do right, to acknowledge the people who had been invisible to my parents, to restore a small measure of justice to the world they had tried so hard to bend to their will. Then came the flood. My phone, which had been silent for days, began to light up with a fury. It was a relentless assault of calls and texts from numbers I didn't recognize, friends of theirs, distant relatives, people they had enlisted to plead their case. The messages from my parents themselves were a toxic cocktail of rage, guilt, and pathetic attempts at manipulation. My father sent long, rambling texts about how I had destroyed the family legacy, how his father must have been senile. My mother sent old family photos with captions like, "Remember when we were happy. You've thrown all this away." After the 129th missed call in a single day, I sat on my grandfather's desk, looked at their names on the screen, and methodically blocked their numbers. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of peace. It was the final digital severing of a cord that should have been cut long ago. The day they finally left was quiet and overcast. A modest moving van, a stark contrast to the fleet of luxury cars that usually lined the driveway, pulled away, leaving behind a deep silence. I walked through the house, room by empty room. The spaces they had occupied felt cavernous now, stripped of their personality and their pretense. In my my grandfather's study, the massive mahogany desk was clear for the first time in years. I ran my hand over the smooth, cool wood, feeling the faint indentations where he used to write. The house didn't feel empty. It felt like it could breathe again. It was no longer a monument to their vanity. It was a home, a legacy, and now it was my responsibility to fill it not with things but with purpose. I stood at the large bay window overlooking the grounds and felt the weight of that responsibility settle on my shoulders, not as a burden, but as an anchor. I heard about them only once after that. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years called to offer his quiet support and mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd seen them in a supermarket in a town about an hour away. He said they looked ordinary. My father was pushing the cart, his shoulders slumped, wearing a polo shirt that wasn't a designer brand. My mother was comparing prices on canned soup. The image was so mundane, so utterly stripped of the glamour and power they had cultivated their entire lives, that it was more devastating than any courtroom defeat. They hadn't just lost their money. They had lost their identity. They had been reduced to the very thing they feared most, being just like everyone else. There was no pleasure in hearing it, only a quiet, somber finality. Their punishment wasn't poverty. It was anonymity. 2 weeks later, I was back in Mr. Davies's office. This time, the mood was different. It was constructive, forward-looking. We weren't there to dissect the past. We were there to build a future. I signed the papers that officially established the Eleanor Johnston Foundation for Elder Dignity. The mission was simple: to provide grants for high-quality, in-home nursing care for elderly individuals whose families couldn't or wouldn't provide it for them. We used the $2 million from the will as the seed money, but I directed Mr. Davies to structure the trust so that a significant portion of its annual earnings would perpetually fund the foundation. The estate wouldn't be a private piggy bank. It would be an engine for the compassion my grandmother had deserved, a legacy of kindness that would outlive us all. That evening, I went home and did one last thing. My parents had hung a massive abstract modern art piece over the grand fireplace in the main living room, a chaotic splash of colors that had cost a fortune but meant nothing. I took it down myself, the frame heavy and awkward in my hands. I carried it out to the garage and leaned it against the wall, a relic of a bygone era. Then I went to my grandmother's room, which I had left untouched, and took the small black and white photograph of her and my grandfather on their wedding day from her dresser. I brought it downstairs and hung it directly in the center of the wall over the fireplace. They were young, smiling, their faces full of hope and integrity. The house immediately felt warmer, more centered. The soul of the home had been restored. The house is quiet now. It's a different kind of quiet than the one I came home to. It's not the hollow silence of neglect, but the peaceful silence of purpose. I spend my days working with the foundation, meeting with veterans groups and slowly, carefully, turning this massive estate into something more than just a collection of expensive objects. I often sit in my grandfather's study at night, the wedding photo visible through the open door, and I feel a sense of profound clarity. The rage is gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. I didn't fight a war in Iraq just to come home and lose another one here. I fought for honor, for duty, and for the memory of the people who taught me what those words truly mean. Some people inherit money, a name, a collection of assets. I inherited a responsibility, and it's a burden I am proud to carry. If you know someone who needs to hear this message, a story about choosing your own path and standing up for what's right, please share this video with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own strength, even when the world expects you to be weak. Thank you for listening. When I came back from the war, I thought I knew what a battle was. I was wrong. The hardest fight isn't on some dusty foreign battlefield with an enemy you can see. It's in the quiet rooms of your own home, against the people you're supposed to trust. The most important lesson I learned wasn't in boot camp. It was in that silent, lonely mansion. I learned that some things in this world have a price, and some things have a value. My parents knew the price of everything: a yacht in St. Bart's, a Patek Philippe watch, a bottle of vintage champagne. But they never understood the value of a mother's last days, of a grandson's respect, of a family's honor. And in the end, that misunderstanding cost them everything. It's a question I think we all have to ask ourselves. Are we living a life based on price tags or one based on true, unshakable value? I also learned what real strength looks like. It's not about how much weight you can carry or how loud you can shout. I've seen men do incredible things under fire, but I've never seen anything as strong as my grandmother's quiet dignity in the face of being forgotten. True strength is the courage to do the right thing when no one is watching. It's the resolve to stand up to your own family, not with anger and accusations, but with the cold, hard truth. It's choosing the difficult path of justice over the easy path of a fake, comfortable peace. For anyone out there feeling alone in a fight, remember this: your quiet integrity, Your refusal to back down from what you know is right, that is a strength more powerful than any army. It's a silence that roars. My grandfather used to say that a legacy isn't what you leave for people, it's what you leave in them. My parents were obsessed with the inheritance they thought they were getting, the house, the stocks, the art. They saw it as a prize to be won. But they missed the point entirely. The real inheritance my grandfather left me wasn't the estate. It was his moral compass. It was the understanding that our name, our honor, is a trust, and my duty was to protect it from those who would sell it for a life of luxury. We all inherit something. It might not be a mansion in Greenwich, but we inherit our values, our principles. The real question is, what are you doing with your inheritance? Are you spending it, or are you investing it in something that will last? One of the most surprising things I discovered is that justice is often quiet. I had imagined this big dramatic confrontation, a courtroom battle, a moment of explosive revenge, but it never happened. The end for my parents wasn't a bang. It was a whimper. It was the deafening silence on the other end of the phone after I blocked their numbers. It was the image of them in a generic supermarket, stripped of their designer armor, looking completely ordinary. Their punishment wasn't something I inflicted. It was something they chose. They built their entire world on a foundation of sand, and the simple truth was the tide that washed it all away. You don't always have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes all you need to do is stand back and let a person's own character, or lack thereof, burn their world to the ground. Perhaps the hardest part of this whole journey was accepting the truth about my parents. For years I think I was trying to earn the love and respect of two people who were simply incapable of giving it. I was trying to live up to the expectations of a family that didn't really exist. The moment I finally saw them for who they were, not who I wished they were, was both heartbreaking and incredibly liberating. It gave me the freedom to stop seeking their approval and to start living by my own code. It's a painful thing to grieve for the living, for the parents you should have had. But accepting that reality is the first step toward building your own family. One based not on blood, but on shared values of loyalty, respect, and unconditional love. Ultimately, this experience taught me that we have a choice. We can let our pain and our betrayals define us, make us bitter and angry, or we can use that pain as fuel. We can take the ugliest parts of our story and use them to build something beautiful. The foundation I started in my grandmother's name is more than just a charity. It's a testament to that idea. It's proof that compassion can rise from the ashes of cruelty, that purpose can be found in the deepest of wounds. Every person we help is a victory over the selfishness that left her alone. It's my way of turning a legacy of neglect into a legacy of care. Your story, your pain, doesn't have to be an ending. It can be the raw material for a new beginning. So if my story has meant anything to you, I hope it's this: trust your gut. Stand up for the people who can't stand up for themselves. And never ever let anyone convince you that money is more important than character. Your integrity is the one thing no one can take from you unless you give it away. If you know someone who is fighting their own quiet battle and needs to be reminded of their own strength, please share this video with them. And subscribe for more stories about finding your own way and building a life with purpose. Thank you for listening to mine.